Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if Izuku ate the mochi no mi? AizenTheGoat wrote this amazing story. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. A young 4-year-old green-haired boy was feeling worse than he ever had in his short life. He and his mother had just returned home from the doctor's office where he had been told that he was quirkless. 80% of the world was born with some sort of power or another, but the unlucky 20% were born regular humans. Safe to say all men were not created equal. That same day at home his mother had made his favorite foods in an attempt to cheer him up. The poor boy faked a smile and ate his food in silence. Inko knew her son was heartbroken but didn't want to say anything else. She was barely holding it together as it was. She felt like she failed as a mother. She watched sadly as Izuku thanked her for the food with a forced smile and headed to his room. Like he had done since he could remember, the young boy played a video of the number one hero, All Might, saving civilians from a burning building with a smile on his face. The sound of his room door opening forced him to turn to see his mom standing at the doorway. "Look, Mom. All Might saved everyone," with a smile on his face. He told her, his small eyes glazing over with tears. The boy quickly found himself being enveloped in a hug by his mother, who kept repeating, "I'm so sorry." In her embrace he finally let the waterworks flow and cried his little heart out. He cried so long and so hard that he never realized when he fell asleep. 2 days later Izuku was walking hand in hand with his mom to the grocery store. The word had somehow gotten out that he was diagnosed quirkless. Those who knew the family sent him and his mom pitying looks, as they knew how the minority was treated this day and age. Seeing those looks directed at them only made the young boy feel even worse. It took them about an hour, but they had bought everything to make food for the next few days. On the way back his mom stopped by a small stand selling a variety of sweets. He watched as his mom tried a free sample of mochi. Her eyes lit up and ordered a couple cakes. She turned to him with a small piece and offered it to him. He shook his head no, and the pair continued home. The next 6 years of his life were monotonous, as he'd found himself in the same cycle. Go to school where he'd be bullied by some of the kids for being quirkless. Go home and do his homework. Go buy food from the grocery store and pass by the small stand with his mom. He would never tell his mom this, but the owner of the sweet stand scared him slightly. She was an old lady, very old actually. His 10-year-old mind didn't know how it was possible for her to still be alive. He never voiced his thoughts though, as he knew his mother would reprimand him. And although she was scary looking, she was actually very nice to him. She would always let him have a small donut for free and tell his mom how adorable he was. The first time he'd seen her, his eyes had been drawn to 3 things: her longer than average red nose, her white hair that had traces of purple in it, and the diagonal scar that ran from the right side of her forehead to the left side of her mouth. He had expected her to be a mean old witch, but she was surprisingly kind. "Izuku," his mom called him, breaking his thoughts. "We're out of vegetables. We're going to have to run down to the supermarket real quick," she tells him. He nodded and went to his room to put his shoes on. When he made it back to the living room, she was checking her purse and motioned for him to exit. As they walked to the store, Izuku was having a strange feeling. Something was coming. He'd get brief flashes of color in his sight. Those colors seemed to be moving left to right before stopping. Something was going to happen. Moments later he was proven right, as from the corner in front of them a man in a black mask with blades for hands ran to them. Izuku felt the wind leave his body as the man kicked him and proceeded to take his mother hostage. The young boy watched as cops and some pro-heroes proceeded to surround the man, but didn't get any closer as he put a blade to her throat. "Mom?" He yelled and tried to get up, only to feel his body get constricted and pulled away by some branches. "Sorry kid, but it's too dangerous to let you get close," Kamui Woods, an up-and-coming hero, told him. "The man is high on some sort of drug and is completely unstable. We don't want to risk anything setting him off even more," he explained as the cops had their guns pointed at the man. "Villain!" One of the cops yelled through a microphone, "Leave the woman alone and give yourself up. You're completely surrounded. Don't make things worse on yourself." The man answered by pressing the blade closer to her throat. "Shut up. If you don't get out of my way, I'll kill her, you hear me?" he said in crazy manner. The cops stood still, not wanting to risk him following through with the threat, but kept their guns pointed at him. Suddenly everyone noticed as his blade seemed to shrink in size rapidly. "Shit," he yelled, realizing that the drug effect was running out. "If I'm going to be put away, I might as well make it worth it," he yelled before he stabbed Inko in her lower back. As soon as she released a scream of pain, the cops opened fire on the man and Kamui Woods dashed down to subdue the man on the off chance that he survived. Izuku watched as a small pool of blood began growing around the downed form of his mother. His screams were overshadowed by the screams of civilians who caught the whole thing and the sounds of the paramedics arriving on the scene. His throat hurt from yelling, but he didn't stop. He was angry, distressed, and sad all at once. If he was stronger, he could have stopped his mom from getting hurt. If he'd had a quirk, this could have been avoided. Those were the thoughts that plagued his head as he was being led to the hospital by Kamui Woods and some police officers. A week later, Izuku sat in the same chair that he'd been sitting in for the past 7 days next to his bedridden mother. The doctors had said it was a miracle, but she wouldn't be paralyzed. She'd eventually be able to walk again, but there'd be some complications. She'd never be able to run or walk for more than a few hours a day. She'd have a wheelchair assigned to her for when she needed it, but she wouldn't be losing feeling in her lower half. He sniffed, trying to stop the tears that wanted to come out. Izuku, her soft voice called out to him. "Honey, it's okay. I'm alive," she assured him with a smile. "But you got hurt. Because of me," he said in between sniffles. "Because I was born quirkless. The kids at school were right. I am a deku," he said angrily. "No, you're not," she told him calmly. "I was useless. You got hurt because I couldn't do anything. I was powerless and you were hurt because of it. I'm weak. I couldn't protect you," he cried. His mom smiled at him. "Sweetie, you're 10 years old. Even if you had a quirk, the chances of this happened were high. The man was on some sort of drug from what the cops told me. If you tried to stop him, you would have died." Seeing that he'd stopped crying, she continued. "Don't blame yourself. Besides, the doctor said I'll recover. We'll be able to go home soon." She patted his head softly. "Can you do me a favor, Izuku?" He looked up at her. "I've only had this terrible hospital food for the past week. Can you run down to the sweet stand and get me some mochi?" He nodded and took the money out of her purse before promising to be back quickly. His mother smiled at him and told him she'd be waiting for him. He made sure to wipe his eyes with his sleeve as he exited the hospital. It only took him a few minutes to reach the stand. Luckily or unluckily, depending on who you asked, there was no other customers at the stand. The only person there was the owner. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he greeted. She might scare him, but he was still polite. The old woman looked down at him with a small smile. "Hello, young man. Buying sweets for your mom? Mochi?" she asked as she recognized him. He didn't answer verbally but nodded in confirmation. "Excuse me for a moment and I'll get your order," she told him before walking deeper into the building that the stand was extruding from. A few minutes later, the woman came back holding 2 baskets in her hands. One was filled to the brim with mochi and other sweets, while the other one he didn't see anything in. How much will it be?" he asked, hoping he'd grabbed enough money. "It's on the house. Consider it a get-well-soon gift to your mom. I heard about what happened the other week. I'm so sorry, young one." She gave her condolence. The memory of what happened came back full force and he looked down, taking deep breaths, not wanting to make a scene in front of the old woman. "Are you okay?" she asked in a grandmotherly voice. He nodded but still didn't look up. "You blame yourself, don't you?" His head snapped up, surprise clear in his eyes. "You believe your mom got hurt because of you, don't you?" she continued. "How did you know?" he asked, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "The look in your eyes when I saw you. You remind me of my late brother," she told him. She pointed at the scar on her face. "See this? I got this when I was a little girl. A bully got mad that my brother beat him up and in retaliation he cut my face. My older brother blamed himself and thought that it was all his fault," she said with a laugh at the end. She looked up into the sky with a wistful look on her face as she took a trip down memory lane. From that day on, he vowed that he'd never be weak again to be able to protect his family. She finished. Izuku could see the similarities between the woman's brother and himself from how she described him. Everything he was feeling was exactly as she had said. Just like her brother, he too felt responsible for what happened to his mom. "You're the one I've been looking for," she said, looking right at him. His face scrunched up in confusion. "I'm sorry?" he asked, not understanding. She grabbed the second basket and handed it to him, motioning him to look inside. Doing so, he came face to face with a large green fruit with strange swirl-like patterns on it. Seeing the young boy's confusion grow, she spoke again. "That right there is a devil fruit, young man." He frowned. A devil fruit? He'd never heard of such a thing. It's a special type of fruit that when consumed gives the eater special abilities. The abilities gained vary depending on the type of fruit you eat, all at the expense of losing the ability to swim. Izuku held on to every word, completely enthralled by the story. His heart was pounding in his chest as his mind raced with the possibilities. "Where I come from there's thousands of these, but the time of devil fruits has long since passed. Hearing that last bit of information, he stopped his train of thoughts as a new thought entered. Not to be rude, but how old are you? He asked. The woman stopped and grabbed her chin, closing her eyes in concentration. I forgot, ha, she laughed in amusement. Izuku's sweat dropped as the old woman composed herself. Now where was I? Oh yes, this is my dear brother's devil fruit. The mochi no mi. It granted him the ability to create, control, and transform into mochi. At first it might sound lame or even useless, but with this he became one of the strongest men I ever knew. So powerful it was said that his back never touched the floor in battle. She told him with pride. She added the last bit as she knew he liked to lounge around on his back and eat donuts. The thought brought a smile to her face. Izuku, though young, could tell by how she spoke how much her brother must have meant to her. That itself brought up another question. Why me? She didn't miss a beat in answering. Because you remind me of him. I've been looking for someone like him to pass his fruit to so that his spirit may live on. I can tell I don't have much time left. So Izuku, she said, surprising him that she knew his name. Though it shouldn't be that much of a surprise as she knew his mom kinda well. Will you take the fruit and carry on his legacy? She asked. Izuku grabbed the fruit and held it up to eye level. I'm quirkless. If she's telling the truth and it really can grant me power, I can protect my mom. She'll never get hurt again. He thought. I will. He said with conviction and took it down in one bite. Only to hold his throat in disgust as it goes down. The old lady meanwhile laughs to herself as she watches him pass the fruit down. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, devil fruits taste horrible. She tells him, amused. He glares lightly at her but wipes his mouth and spits to the side, trying to get the foul taste out of his mouth. He looks down at his body before looking at his arms. He didn't feel any different. I'm sure you'll figure out how to use it soon enough. Now shouldn't you be taking those sweets to your mom? She asks, making his eyes widen. Oh man, you're right. He says, panicking as he grabs the basket and heads out, though he stops right before the exit. He put the basket down, turned around and bowed deeply. Thank you very much, ma'am. I promise I'll use the fruit to do good by my family like your brother did. In his memory, I promise my back will never touch the ground. He finished before grabbing the basket and running out. The old woman watches him run in the direction of the hospital with a determined look on his face. She smiled before beginning to pack everything up and closing up shop. She waved at a few young people who knew her from the area before walking into an alley and pulling out a mirror. The mirror glowed slightly before removing her reflection and showing a colorful world on the other side. She grabbed a rock before stepping into it. On the other side she looked back and threw the rock at the mirror, shattering it. She smiled and laid down on the ground as he breathing became heavier. Katakuri and I-san. I finally found someone like you to give the fruit to. I'll tell you all about him soon. She said before the light in her eyes faded. Next day, Midoriya household. Izuku woke up earlier than usual, a frown on his face. He'd had the strangest dream. He was watching a battle between a man in a straw hat and a giant man with a scarf around the lower half of his face. The strange thing was the abilities the larger man was using were oddly familiar. He stopped as he remembered the previous day with the old woman. That was her brother, he said to himself. He was using the mochi no mi powers. He added. He brought his hand up and remembered how the large man had changed the shape of his arm. To his amazement, his arm turned almost white as it turned into mochi. Then to his horror it began to seemingly melt. He panicked and shook his hand in an attempt to stop it from falling off. Stop, 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 he screamed in his mind. And just like that, the mochi turned back into the familiar form of his arm. He let out a deep breath and laid back down. He closed his eyes and replayed the parts of the battle he had seen. The man turned his arms into a mace and somehow coated it in a black substance to add power to it. He was able to stretch his arms and mold the size of them as well. Thought the most amazing in his mind was how he was able to somehow create holes in his body to dodge attacks. He wondered if that's the level he'd be able to get to. Well, I promised the old woman I'd carry on his legacy, so I guess it's time to start training. No one will never get hurt because of me again. He said before spending the rest of the day training his new powers. 4 years have passed since the day our green-haired protagonist ate the strange fruit. In that time a lot has changed. Now 14, Izuku stood a little taller, nowhere near the size of Broly's brother mind you, but at a good 5 feet 5 inches. He's lost most of his baby fat around his face and has also toned up a bit due to daily exercise he's done. All of that wasn't the biggest change in his life, however. True to their words, his mom was making a great albeit slow recovery. She couldn't run but could walk on her own for a few hours before needing to sit down. When going out she still had to take the wheelchair as the doctors advised her to do so in case of emergencies. Though there was still a long road ahead of them, he was happy to know that with enough physical therapy maybe she wouldn't need the wheelchair at all in the future. Another change was in regards to his power. Almost every day since he ate the mochi no mi, he'd have movie-like dreams about the woman's brother. Katakuri, as he'd learned he was called. It was almost like he was watching the man's life. He didn't know if that was normal and couldn't exactly ask since the woman who gave him the power was no longer around. The dreams varied from exciting battles to watching the man eat donuts in private. He now understood why he was given free donuts when his mom would stop for sweets. Being the hero enthusiast that he was, he made sure to write down the dreams/visions in as much detail as possible when waking up. A good idea on his part, as they definitely came in handy for training. It had taken a while to get the hang of it down, but he was making progress. He would no longer melt as soon as he turned into mochi. At the present time he could stretch his limbs a considerable distance. He hadn't measured exact distance because he didn't have anywhere with enough space. He also learned how to transform parts of his body into different shapes. He could make a morning star similar to the one Katakuri would constantly make. Rearranging his body to avoid attacks took a little longer than making shapes though. It took over a year to be able to create a hole in his body without having to consciously think about it. In the end he had to grab a small rubber ball and throw it at a wall in front of him, then wait for it to bounce back at him. Right before it would hit him he'd try and let it pass through him. It wasn't the best training technique, but it worked. The use of that technique, however, always brought a frown on his face. He'd seen Katakuri do it at such a speed that it was almost impossible to keep track of. In the battle with the straw hat, who he'd learned was called Luffy, he manipulated his body fast enough to keep up with the red blurs that was Luffy's attack. Even with all that progress under his belt, there was still one thing that he hadn't made any progress on. He couldn't coat any part of his body with that black substance he'd seen. That simple application seemed to boost the damage and power of their attacks. It also seemed that the black substance wasn't exclusive to his fruit, as Luffy could do it as well. Izuku grabbed a nearby notebook titled Devil Fruit Analysis and looked over his previous entry. The last thing he'd written about was the strange colors he'd see. At first it happened when his eyes were closed and he focused, or suddenly when someone was close by. He recalled how on the day of the attack, right before the villain appeared, he'd seen random color in his vision. It moved left to right before stopping. The colors represented presence and movement. It was almost like he knew someone was coming. The colors in his vision were happening a lot more frequently now and more detailed. Occasionally he'd be in his room when he'd see a green outline of a hand reaching for a similarly green outline door. Moments later his mom would be walking into the room asking about dinner. It was like he was getting a glance into the future. He stopped reading and put the notebook down, a look of realization dawning on him. It would make sense then how Katakuri could dodge the attacks that fast and accurately. He would see them coming and move his body accordingly ahead of time. He scribbled in his notebook furiously, writing down the different ways he could test that theory out. Could there be a way to gain that kind of foresight? How far into the future was Katakuri seeing? It had to be more than just tiny glimpses like him. If he could get to that level, it could help him use the fruit to its fullest capabilities. As he finished writing down his thoughts, a flash of green once again appeared in his mind's eye. He closed the notebook and threw it under his bed in a hurry. A second later his mom peeked her head in. "Sweetie, I have to go to the store and buy some more rice. I'll be back in a bit, okay?" she told him. "I'll probably stop by for some sweets too," she said with a happy look on her face. "Do you want me to go with you? Don't forget your chair. Make sure you have your phone and call me if..." He was cut off by his mom, who had a fake look of annoyance on her face. "I'm just partially crippled. I'm not completely helpless, you know," she told him. "All right, but still call if you need me," he told her as she headed out. He let out a breath. "If I didn't have that strange light in my vision, she'd have seen what I was writing," he thought to himself. He hadn't told his mom about his power yet. It wasn't that he didn't want her to know, it was the fact that she'd worry once he told her and she'd start doting on him a lot more. It would make training difficult with his mom worrying about him. He had a feeling, however, that she knew, or at the very least suspected something though. She'd give him a strange look whenever he'd tell her he was going to the library to study, when in reality he was heading to an abandoned building on the other side of town. It was the only place where nobody would see him and he could practice controlling his mochi. He would tell her soon though. It was almost time to apply to U.A, and that's when he'd tell her. His smile dropped slightly at the last part his mom had said. The day after he'd gotten the fruit, Brulee had disappeared. She had told him she didn't have much time left, so he assumed it had finally come. In an attempt to thank her for what she'd done for him, he'd say a small prayer for her every morning before starting his day. Shaking his head of those thoughts, he headed to the shower to prepare for the day. 2 hours later he was once again on his way to the abandoned building he'd claimed as his own training ground. It was the perfect place for now, but he knew he'd have to switch spots for the more destructive techniques. In the meantime, it worked well enough for him to practice learning Katakuri's fighting style. Half an hour later, as he walked through the slums of the city, he could feel eyes following him as he walked. He wasn't exactly in the safest part of the city, but this is the first time someone has actually attempted to follow him. He stopped, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. Behind him, a few hundred feet, two red human outlines were leaning up against a wall trying to look inconspicuous. He opened his eyes and kept walking. As he got to the building, he made no indication that he knew he was being followed and headed inside. They should be here soon, he thought as he walked up to the second floor. As he waited for his soon-to-be victims, he went through a set of katas, doing his best to imitate Katakuri's fighting style, which revolved around fast punches and hard kicks. He had been doing his best to increase his speed as well, and he was proud to say it was coming along well. Well, look what we have here. A raspy voice came from behind him. Looking behind him, he saw two men twirling knives in their hands, looking down at him. Malicious smirks on their faces. A kid in the wrong place practicing karate or something. He continued before he and his partner broke out in laughter. You're quirkless, huh, brat? The other man asked. Save yourself a lifetime of disappointment and get out of here, kid. This is our turf. Make sure to leave any money your mom might have given you too, he added. Izuku stared back at the men, a serious expression on his face. Make me. The two adults frowned. Fine, you want to die young, you'll die young. The first man who spoke rushed at him, knife ready to slash him. It was no use, as he pretty much telegraphed his movement, which made it easy for him to sidestep. As soon as he moved, a red fist shape appeared in his vision. He ducked under the punch that was coming, spun around and kicked upwards. Turning his leg into mochi, he extended it rapidly, kicking the man in the chin. His head flew back, blood flying out of his mouth as his body was shot into the air. Izuku wasn't done yet, however, as he swung his hand at the man, extending his arm and turning his hand into the signature Morning Star Katakuri was fond of using. He wished he could have added the black coating, but it would do for now. The mochi construct hit the man with enough force that he was shot into the wall, leaving spider cracks in it. The man dropped to the floor, his eyes having rolled into the back of his head. Now it's just you, Izuku told the man as he turned around. Unsurprisingly, the man's eyes were wide as saucers, now having realized they had picked with the wrong person. Izuku watched the many expressions on the man's face. It went from shock to fright to resolve. The thug grit his teeth and rushed forward to thrust the blade at him. Unfortunately for him, it was no use. Izuku kicked the man's wrist, forcing him to drop the knife before spinning and kicking the man in the chest, pushing him back a few feet. The man dropped to a knee, trying to get air into his body as that kick had winded him. Izuku's leg was turning into mochi as he prepared to finish it off, but stopped as he remembered something. It was a technique he hadn't tried yet that he'd seen in one of his dreams. He took a deep breath and willed his arms and torso into mochi. He almost became giddy when he looked up and saw 6 tendrils above him take the shape of his fists. As the man was finally getting up on his feet, he willed them to attack. All 6 extra fists attacked rapidly at different intervals, making dodging almost impossible. Apart from that, his own 2 original fists also added to the damage. In a matter of seconds, over 100 punches were landed. Willing the mochi back into his body, he took a couple deep breaths while looking at the damage. The man was out cold, his face bloodied and body bruised. Increasing the size of his hand, he gathered the 2 men and shot them out of the nearest window. They'd survive, a few broken bones and a bruised ego, but they'd survive. Wasn't much of a challenge. This power is amazing, he said to himself as he clenched his fist in front of his face. Patting himself on the back for a few more seconds, he shook his head and went back to training. The next day at school. Now I hope you've all thought long and hard about your future and where you want to be. Their teacher began as he looked through the stack of papers in his hand. He flipped through a couple before looking back at the class. Oh, who am I kidding? You're all going for heroics, aren't you? He asked rhetorically, throwing all of the papers on his desk. The classroom went wild with cheers. Some of the kids even displayed their quirks in their excitement. He raised his hands and waved them up and down in an attempt to calm them down. Bakugo, he called out. You actually applied to U.A, didn't you? He asked the sandy blonde. Immediately the class broke out into mutters. He may be an asshole, but he has a shot to make it in, one student commented. With an attitude like his, I doubt it. Another added. Well, he has a pretty powerful quirk, so he's almost guaranteed to get in. Another pitched their 2 cents. Yeah, I already aced the mock exam. You extras can bet I'm gonna be the first person at U.A to come from this dump of a school. Bakugo replied, small explosions going off in his hands. Actually, Midoriya. The teacher called out, ignoring Bakugo's insults to the others and the school as the staff usually did. You applied to U.2 it looks like. At that the class once again broke out. Though rather than praise and kind words everyone began laughing, scoffing in some cases. Midoriya is quirkless, he'll never get in. I'll be surprised if they even let him take the entrance exam. One of Bakugo's friends said between laughs. They're gonna laugh at him harder than we are. Another replied. The nerd can do whatever he wants, but in the end he's still a quirkless nobody. He'll learn his lesson soon enough. Bakugo said out loud while giving Izuku a hard glare. Had he never obtained the mochi no mi, maybe he'd be crying in shame right now at the harsh words his classmates were sending his way, but things had changed. No one knew about his power and he intended to keep it that way until necessary. He sat back in his chair, one leg folded on top of the other while his arms were crossed in front of his chest. His eyes were closed and stayed that way until finally the teacher calmed everyone down and made them give him a half-assed apology. At the end of the day, as he was packing up his things, he could feel the stare of Bakugo on his back but paid it no mind. He knew for certain that the boy would try and say something to him. Sure enough, as he was at the front gate of the school, a hand grabbed onto his shoulder. He'd seen it coming but decided against doing something about it as he didn't want to raise suspicions. Listen here, nerd, I'm only going to say this one more time. No matter how much you try, you'll always be a powerless loser. Withdraw your application from U.A and you'll save yourself the humiliation. Izuku turned his head to stare back at the boy but didn't reply. He shook the hand off his shoulder and continued home. He didn't have time to think about Bakugo's empty threats. He was thinking of how his mom would react when he told her tonight about his power. He even went as far as to take a different route than his usual to think a little more. Unknown to him, that action would shape the world in a completely different way. The talk with his mom that night went almost as he expected. His mom was both thrilled and upset at the same time. Sure enough, she was upset with him for eating a strange fruit from someone without going to her first. He had technically accepted food from a stranger when he was 10. Her concern was valid, it could have been poisonous. On the other side, she was thrilled because although he was still technically quirkless, he now had the ability to be a hero like he'd always dreamed of. She didn't seem so excited at first when she asked what his power was and he told her he could turn into mochi. However, after a quick demonstration, she had stars in her eyes the way he used to when he'd see a pro hero when he was younger. She even went as far as to make his favorite food. As he laid in bed that night, a few thoughts plagued his mind. I have 10 months before the entrance exam. In that time I need to improve my foresight, quicken my reflexes to use my mochi more efficiently, and how to use the black substance. Hopefully tonight's dream will shed some light on it. He thought to himself before he turned his lamp off and went to bed. In 10 months he'd stun everyone and show them who the future #1 hero was. The time had finally come. The past few years had all been leading to this moment. Today was the day of the U.A entrance exam. Apart from the first few months after getting the mochi no mi, these last 10 months were by far the most brutal in terms of training. All of those hours he spent training, however, had paid off. His control over mochi was great. He had been able to replicate a lot of Katakuri's techniques. All but a handful of them were doable. The others he could do, but his body wasn't physically capable of maximizing the damage the techniques were designed for. When he wasn't training with his control over mochi, he was in the gym that was on the base floor of his apartment building. He realized early on that other than foresight, he'd also need a lot of physical strength to use his power to the fullest. Midoriya had also finally learned what that black substance he'd see in the dreams was. It was something called Busashoku. Unfortunately for him, the name is all he'd gotten. No specifics on how to actually apply it. He was disappointed but not completely surprised. He'd had the fruit in the dreams/visions for almost 5 years now. If he recalled correctly, Katakuri was somewhere between 40 and 50 in all of the visions he'd seen. If he really was seeing the man's memories or experiences, it could take a while before he got to a memory that'd teach him how to use it. Still, it wasn't all that bad. While he didn't know how to use Busashoku yet, he did learn something else. He had something called Kenbunshiku. It's what allowed him to catch those short glimpses into the future in the form of colored outlines. What really surprised him though was that he had it even before he'd eaten the devil fruit. He briefly wondered if maybe that was his quirk, but ruled it out as it would have been caught by any doctor. Apart from discovering its name, his Kenbunshiku had also improved. He still saw silhouettes in color and outlines, but on the rare occasion he'd get a second or two of actual images. That had started one day a few months ago when he'd been training in the abandoned house. Apparently the damage he'd caused by slamming the thugs into the wall had been worse than he thought. As he was training, molding his body to let items pass through him, it happened. He threw the ball and instantly had a vision of a part of the roof collapsing above him. It was much more useful than the outlines he currently saw. He tried to replicate it but found that he couldn't even if he concentrated. Only outlines. He'd later found out that the actual solid visions would come only when he was in danger of being critically injured. He made sure to write that down in his notebook for future reference. In his dreams he had seen that Katakuri could seemingly see into the future at will. In an effort to reach that level he made sure to use his Kenbunshoku haki whenever possible. To make up for the lack of Busashoku haki, he'd looked into the composition of mochi and learned that if left out long enough it could harden. It took him a couple days but he learned how to change the solidity of his mochi just to add a little more power. It was nowhere near the level he wanted but it was a start. Now it was time to show everyone who he was. He entered the prestigious school and saw everyone in their school's respective PE uniforms as they'd been instructed to wear. He looked around to see if there was anyone he knew around but no luck. He knew that Bakugo would be here but had no desire to sit next to him. He shrugged and continued on his way. He looked around and noticed everyone walking in a single direction. Since he didn't know where everything was he figured he'd follow them. 5 minutes into his walk, he noticed a brown-haired short girl just a few inches shorter than him walking before she suddenly seemed to lose her balance. He watched in mild amusement as she flailed her arms around in an attempt to keep herself outright. In the end she lost the battle and began her descent. Or at least she would have, as soon as Izuku saw her falling his arm extended without thinking. His hand increased in size and wrapped around her before putting her back upright. At least Bakugo wasn't here to see that, he thought to himself as he walked over to her. Hey, are you okay? He asked. Yeah, she nodded. Was that you who helped me? She asked. Yeah, I saw you falling and just gave you a hand. He told her. Thanks, she told him with a big smile. Was that your quirk? What was it? It felt like some sort of paste. She asked in rapid succession. The green-haired young man nodded. Yup, that was my quirk. Mochi. He looked around to make sure no one was paying any attention to them before willing his arm to turn white and stretch. Retracting it he looked back up at the girl who now sported stars in her eyes and a watery mouth. You all right there? He asked, snapping his fingers in front of her face. The girl snapped out of her trance and blushed in embarrassment. Sorry, it's just that mochi is my favorite food. You're so lucky to have that as a quirk. My name is Uraraka Ochako, by the way, she said, bowing at the end. Izuku's sweat dropped but responded. Midoriya Izuku, nice to meet you. What's your quirk if you don't mind me asking? Her face lost its red hue. Zero gravity. I remove the effects of gravity of anything I touch with the pads of my fingers. But if I use it for too long I end up getting sick, she explained. He nodded and instinctively began thinking of all of the possibilities of a quirk like that. No matter how much he tried to get rid of that habit it just wouldn't go away. He was broken from his thoughts when she spoke again. Well, I'm sorry but I have to go meet up with a friend, she's probably waiting for me. It was nice meeting you, Midoriya-kun, hopefully we both make it in, she told him before running off. Uraraka, he called out, making her turn around. She had a curious look on her face that quickly changed to happiness when made a small cake slice out of mochi and threw it softly at her. She caught it, stars once again in her eyes. Thank you, she yelled as she took a bite and took off. He shook his head in amusement before continuing on at his own pace. Eventually he made it to one of the receptionists who handed him a form indicating what field he'd be in. Apparently everyone had been separated into one of 4 different fields. They were told to head to the auditorium for a brief overview of the exam before the actual thing. The test was relatively straightforward. There was 4 different robot types they could encounter, each worth a different amount. Either 1, 2, 3 or 0 points. The more robots you destroyed the more points you'd accumulate. Simple. Sometime during the explanation a student with glasses and overly stiff hand motions had spoken out about a mistake on their paper regarding the 0-pointer. Present Mike, who was the administrator of this portion of the exam, explained about the 0-pointer. That doesn't make sense, he thought to himself. Why make something that big if it isn't worth any points? It's either a trap or there's some deeper meaning behind it. 10 minutes later the presentation was finished and everyone was escorted to their respective gates for the exam to begin. Izuku stood in front of the gate with the rest of the participants, bouncing on the balls of his feet, getting ready. Here we go, he said softly to himself as he closed his eyes. He saw the red silhouette of the gate open but the people stayed in place. Sure enough, the gate opened. Go, Present Mike yelled. The moment the gate was opened enough for him to squeeze through he moved. Izuku ran through the small opening and jumped. His entire being turned into mochi, which he used to move faster as opposed to running. He'd seen Katakuri use the same technique to stop Luffy from showing his mom a broken picture. Materializing his head at the front, he willed the mochi to move faster. Back with the group at the starting line, most of the contestants were looking confused as this wasn't the usual 1-2-3 go that they were accustomed to. Everyone looked up to see Present Mike grinning madly. What? There are no countdowns during a villain attack. Go go go. He yelled, making hand motions to everyone. Finally everyone seemed to realize that they were behind and ran in. Far up ahead, Izuku had already managed to destroy 8 of the 3-point robots. Grabbing onto the top of a building, he let his mochi propel him into the air, right above a 1-pointer. Letting gravity do its job, he increased the size of his hand and turned it into a morning star. Making sure to change its solidity, he swung his arm down and smiled when the robot broke into pieces. He frowned as he saw many of the pieces flying in the direction of some of the students who had managed to finally make it. Most of them were distracted by looking for robots that they didn't notice things around them. Using his other arm, he extended it before it branched out into 3 arms, each grabbing a participant and moving them out of the way of the shrapnel. Letting them go once they were safe, he climbed to the top of a building looking for more targets. It didn't take long to find a group of 3-pointers in the distance. That's easy points, but they're too far for me to run to. By the time I get there, they'll probably already be destroyed. I can risk trying to use Buzz Cut Mochi to get there. I can't control it at the speed necessary for it to be effective. He thinks to himself. He looked to his left and to his right. That's it, he said out loud. He extended his arms to hold the edges of each building. Letting more mochi flow, he jumped backwards off the building he was on and took a few more steps just for an extra push. Those around him watched as his arms stretched out, similar to how a slingshot looked before being fired. Mochi slingshot, everyone heard as he stopped resisting and let his arms pull his body. The moment he picked up enough speed, he let go of his grip on the buildings and soared through the air in the direction of the robots. He was approaching them rapidly. Flipping his body in midair so his legs were in front, he willed the mochi to manifest. Willow Mochi. His right leg extended before breaking apart into 10 and hardening. Making them all attack at rapid intervals, the robots broke apart in seconds due to the barrage. That's 30 points already, he said as he landed. Feeling the ground shake near him, he turned around and saw 2 2-pointers walking about. They were in pretty close range to him and seemed to have him in their sights. Wait until they line up, he murmured, watching the 2 robots come near him. As they took more steps, inching closer to him, he planted his feet and cocked his right arm back. His forearm began to grow slowly before turning a reddish-orange color, getting lighter the longer he held it. Finally, once the 2 robots were lined up, he attacked. Yakimachi, he punched. Those who were around watched with different expressions on their faces as his right arm flew off of his body right up to the elbow. What was more impressive or frightful, depending on who you asked, was that the fist he shot caught fire while in the air before going through both robots with ease. Monitor room. In the dark room stood a group of well-known pro heroes watching the entrance exam go down. The first is the current #1 hero. He's taller than your average man with slicked back blonde hair with 2 tufts that stick up above his head. He wears a blue tight bodysuit with red stripes that resemble a Y at the chest. Tashinori Yagi, known to the world as All Might. Sitting down next to him was a tired-looking man with bags under his eyes. He wore black pants with a matching black long-sleeved shirt and a gray scarf around his neck. He's the underground hero Eraserhead. Next up is a man with a black mask with golden jaw guards as well as matching golden ear guards. He wears a tan cloak that covers most of his body. The area over his torso and the high collar resemble a double-breasted trench coat. He's pro-hero Ectoplasm. Next is arguably the most popular and most attractive female hero in the game. She wears a black leotard over a flesh-colored bodysuit along with black thigh-high stockings as well as black high-heeled boots. To finish off the ensemble, she wears a small red mask outlining her eyes as well as a handcuff on each wrist. She's the 18+ only hero Midnight. Finally, the smallest member of the group. He seems to be a combination of a large rat, a small bear, or a medium-sized dog. He wears a white long-sleeved shirt and red tie under a black vest. To finish his look, he has black matching pants along with some brown Timbs. This was the principal of High. Mizu. There's some good talent this year. Midnight commented as she watched the participants take out robots left and right. Ectoplasm nodded. Right. Quite a few of them have some powerful quirks. Like this one, he said, pointing to a screen. Everyone turns their attention to one of the screens. It showed the image of a sandy blonde-haired student using an explosion quirk to take down robots quickly. He's got talent, that's for sure. His attitude, however, will certainly be a hindrance to him in the future. Eraserhead commented. Everyone nodded with the man's observation as hearing the kid scream die to one of the robots with a sadistic look on his face told it all. That and he currently had no rescue points under his belt. Look at this one too. Midnight spoke again, pointing at another screen. This one showed the moment when Izuku used Yaki Mochi to destroy the two robots coming his way. Nizu said while scratching his chin. He inflated his forearm until the pressure caused it to explode. It then moved fast enough that the friction from the air hitting the fist caused it to catch on fire. Very impressive. He commented before looking over at the tired-looking man. Aizawa, what is his quirk? The man flipped through a few forms from the section the kid was in before putting it out in front of him. Mochi. This caused some eyebrows to be raised. It's such a simple quirk that one would instantly write off as useless compared to some of the others we've seen, the scruffy man continued. All Might chipped in next. True, but the way he uses it makes you see otherwise. He looked back at the screen. But what is he going to do now? He's missing half of his arm. The heroes watched in both shock and amazement as the green-haired boy brought his arm up to face level and created another arm out of mochi. They watched as the mochi took the shape of the arm before turning solid. Did the kid just regrow his arm? Ectoplasm asked, clearly surprised. It looks like the mochi replaces whatever limb he loses and then literally turns into skin and bone. Midnight commented, what the hell kind of mochi is that? She wondered. All but one were slightly creeped out by the display. How interesting. Nizu yelled in excitement. But let's see how they react to this. He commented before pressing a button next to him. He sat back and watched the screens as 4 0-pointers were about to appear. One at each designated field. Back in the arena with Izuku, things were going well. He'd destroyed quite a bit more robots even while bailing out some of the less aware people. 66 points. I think that should be enough. He said to himself as he looked around. There wasn't too many robots now that they were this far into the exam. It didn't bother him though, as he figured he'd done enough to secure himself a spot at UA. As he was going to find a nice place to sit, the ground started shaking and buildings began to crumble. Everyone stopped what they were doing to look at the newest villain that had appeared. It towered over anything they'd seen so far and looked a lot more durable than the others. Faster too. It moved forward and threw a punch down near him. He quickly grabbed two girls near him and used his mochi to get them out of the way. Once safe, the two girls ran off along with the other examinees who realized their quirks wouldn't help them against something like this. As the participants ran past him, he noticed the short brown-haired girl from earlier had half of her body stuck under some debris from the last attack the robot had shot. No one stopped to help the girl even as she tried her hardest to free herself. He looked up and noticed the robot getting closer to her. I'm not helpless anymore. No one will be hurt because of my lack of power anymore. He thought to himself as he ran towards the girl. He quickly wrapped the girl's upper body in mochi and forcibly pulled her out. She winced as her bottom half was probably in pain but made no other sounds. Thanks again. She moaned out. Don't mention it. Can you walk? He asked as he put her down. She shakily stood up and nodded. Good, get out of here, I'll take care of this. She looked up at the giant and then him. She was going to ask how, but the look on his face stopped her. He didn't look scared, anxious, or nervous. His eyes were narrowed and his arms crossed. Good luck, Midoriya-kun. I owe you one. I'll pay you back one day. She told him before heading in the opposite direction of him. He didn't respond as he kept his eyes on the robot. The pulled its arm back and attacked. As the punch neared its target, he acted. The punch hit nothing but air. Izuku now stood off to the side, arms still crossed as he looked for any weak spots in the metal. Unfortunately, almost every inch of it seemed to be reinforced. Moving quickly, he jumped on the arm of the machine and ran up the arm towards the head. Within seconds he was at the top and pulled his arm back. Extending the size of his arm and changing the solidity, he shot the giant fist forward into the head of the machine. It managed to dent it, but other than that the robot regained its balance and set its sights on him again. Not shrinking his arm, he punched again, meeting the punch of the machine. The two fists were in a deadlock until the mochi began to crack when the back of the robot arm used thrusters in the back to increase its pressure. Izuku's fist was pushed back and he had to quickly jump out of the way or else get crushed. Damn this thing, he thought with a frown. If Katakuri were here, he'd destroy this thing without breaking a sweat. How was he supposed to protect anyone as a hero when he couldn't beat a stupid robot? He grit his teeth in anger as the feeling of being useless once again took hold. He hadn't felt this way since eating the fruit. He stared back at the robot with anger in his eyes. This thing isn't going to beat me, he yelled in his mind. He gripped the two buildings to his sides and shot himself into the sky once more. On the way down he remembered the villain attack that left his mom partially paralyzed, the feeling of being weak that he never wanted to feel again. As he came down at increasing speeds he morphed his arm into a giant morning star. "I'll never be weak again," he yelled. Suddenly his arm changed color. Starting at the top all the way to the bottom of his morning star, the mochi took on a black hue. He could feel the change instantly. His mochi was stronger now, much stronger than it had ever been. He swung his arm down and watched in satisfaction as this time his arm completely destroyed the machine. As he landed on the ground he morphed his arm back to normal and inspected it closely. It was completely covered in busashoku haki. He closed his eyes and took the time to feel what it was like. After a minute or so he opened them and forced the haki to recede. Then once more he made a fist and smiled as the black armor reappeared. Right as he let it go again the voice of President Mike was heard letting all examinees know the exam was over. Now to wait for his results. A couple of days later we find Izuku lounging at home watching something on TV. It was a documentary on how quirks came to be and how all might change the game. Well, watching was kind of stretching it. He was half paying attention as sometime during the documentary his mind had begun to remember another dream sequence. This was of a young Katakuri. A few years younger than he is currently perhaps. It took place right after Broly was injured by those bullies her brother had beaten up. In this dream young Katakuri had gotten his hands on a giant trident. He'd robbed it from a man who was foolishly trying to rob him. In no time at all he was able to incorporate the trident with his mochi. Would it be possible for me to replicate it and use it like a support item? Izuku wondered, rubbing his chin. Some heroes used guns and managed to get away with it. What would be the harm? He thought before he remembered a dream from a few years ago. Katakuri had managed to actually hit Luffy with it on the man's side and took out a nice chunk. He winced as he imagined the pain both men must have felt taking a hit from it. I'll probably get heavily fined or it'll get banned outright if I use it like him. If I take a chunk out of someone there's a chance they'd revoke my hero license as well. He thought. That led to another thought. How did the man manage to keep the trident in his body? If he remembered correctly he would summon it from his arm when he needed it, but it was almost as big as he was tall. How exactly did that work? His thoughts were interrupted as his mom walked in, taking heavy breaths as she held her hand out. "It's here," she managed. In her hand was a white envelope with the U.A logo on the front. She handed him the letter with shaky arms and waited for him to open it. Not seeing any point in dragging it out he ripped it open and watched as a small cylinder fell out and hit the ground. Picking it up he placed it on the dining table and pressed the only button on it. A bright light comes from the disc hitting the nearest wall, projecting the image of a room. Izuku raises an eyebrow wondering what this was before the image moves down to show a small rodent in a suit. "Hello young Midoriya. As you may or may not know my name is Nizu. I'm the principal of U.A High." He introduced himself to the camera. Of course Izuku already knew who he was. Growing up he'd taken the time to look into U.A closely. "First let me congratulate you on your stellar performance. You managed to score 66 villain points." Izuku nodded in satisfaction. He knew he had counted correctly. However, that wasn't all there was to the exam. Nizu continued, there was one other parameter of the entrance exam. The rescue portion. An important quality any hero should have is the willingness to save those in need. Take a look. The image on the wall changed to multiple times throughout the exam that he'd moved some participants out of harm's way. Apart from the villain points you managed to score 34 rescue points, giving you a grand total of 100. Taking all of this into consideration you've been placed in Class 1A. Congratulations and welcome to your Hero Academia. Nizu finished before the light died down. The video stopped and he was immediately hugged by his mother who was crying tears of joy while saying how proud of him she was. He looked up with a smile. "I made it." He didn't doubt his ability, but having it confirmed just made it feel real. The next few days consisted of him going to the downstairs gym to work on his muscle. While having Mochi helped out tremendously, he knew he needed more raw power. On the bench press he was currently doing 155 pounds. He would do 10 reps per set and 4 sets. Considering he weighed 125 pounds he was doing good. Over the past few months he'd steadily been increasing the weight. He didn't want to become as big as, say, All Might, but wanted enough muscle to use the more powerful Mochi techniques effectively. The month passed by in a flash. In that time he'd spent most of his time working out his muscle and his cardio by going on morning runs and taking the correct protein. He was glad to see that his work was paying off. He was proud to see that he had good abs and decent-sized muscle. He was lean, his body was perfect for fast movement and strong hits. The perfect balance. His goal was to stay lean, as he'd noticed during training that his movement and attacks were faster. Not only that though. He brought his arm up to face level and made a fist. On command, his Busashoku haki materialized from his fist to his elbow. He had noticed that it wasn't just black but also had a dark blue tint to it as well. After the first time against the robot during the entrance exam, he'd been able to finally use Busashoku. Since then he'd no longer needed to change the solidity of the mochi, as the haki would harden it much better than he could. Unfortunately, for all the progress he'd made, he still couldn't see far into the future on command like he could with his new haki. It irked him to no end, but he knew he'd just have to keep training at it. After all, his armament didn't come in quickly and only happened when he wasn't thinking about it. All of his thoughts came to a halt as he turned his head to check his clock. It was about 11 p.m. Tomorrow was his first day at U.A, and he didn't want to show up with bags under his eyes. Shutting all thoughts out of his mind, he closed his eyes and he was asleep shortly afterward. The next morning, Izuku woke up feeling energized. It was the first step on his way to becoming the #1 hero. After his usual morning prayer to Broly, he had a quick breakfast. He changed into the gray and green uniform he'd received a week ago. For all the rules UA had on their dress code, he was glad they allowed any kind of footwear so long as they were sneakers. He wore his favorite pair. They were a gift his dad had sent him from America a few months ago. They were high-top red, black and white, with most of it being red. The tongue was white with a red tab on it with white lettering. Finishing it off was a black check mark-like logo on both sides. His dad had said they were expensive but didn't say how much. He didn't care though. "Don't you look handsome in your little uniform?" His mom gushed over him, taking pictures on her phone. He smiled, partially embarrassed, before turning to the clock. "Thank Mom, but I have to go. I'll be home later, bye," he told her as he headed out. About half an hour later, thanks to some small delays due to a small-time villain attack an hour earlier, he was finally standing in front of the gate of, arguably the best hero school in the country. This is where it starts, he thought before entering. He walked through the hallways muttering 1A, as he looked from side to side looking for his classroom. Finally he found what he was looking for. A very large door with a huge 1 painted on the front. He reached for the knob but stopped as some loud voices were heard from the other side. "Get your feet off the desk. It's disrespectful to those who once sat in these seats before us," he heard someone shout. He held back a sigh and closed his eyes, knowing exactly who the man was reprimanding. The other person yelled back that he couldn't wait to crush him since he came from an elite school. Only Bakugo could cause him to get a headache simply from speaking. Sure enough, when he opened the door, he saw a young man with glasses, who he briefly recalled was in his area during the entrance exam, chastising Bakugo. Trying to at least, the sandy blonde was no longer paying attention to him as his eyes locked with him. "Deku, you actually made it in here?" he asked/yelled. He was angry to no one's surprise. Izuku just stared back at him with no expression on his face and walked past the two to a seat in the middle of the classroom. As he put his backpack on the desk, he heard someone call out to him. "Midoriya-kun." Looking up, he saw the brown-haired girl he'd saved from tripping waving at him with a smile at him from a chair near the front. "I knew we'd both make it," she told him happily. "Uraraka," he nodded politely, "I'm glad you made it." Soon more people began to trickle in, one at a time. He paid attention to them as they'd be his classmates for the next year. Some notable ones were a young man in the same uniform as him with red spiky hair who seemed to be hyped to be there. Another was a man with blonde hair with a part of it being black on his left side. He gave him a cool guy feeling, but he could tell was forced. He'd have to see what he was really like before forming an opinion on him. Following him was a shorter girl with short dark blue, almost purple hair. What stood out to him was her earlobes. They were headphone jacks. He had to stop his mind from beginning to think of possibilities with such a quirk. Another girl followed. A short hunched-over girl with frog-like attributes. Namely, her tongue and slightly larger hands folded in front of her as she walked. She made eye contact with him and nodded in greeting. He returned the gesture before looking at the others. The one who followed was strange. He had two-toned hair, half being white with a part of it being red. Naturally, his eyes drifted to the scar on the left side of his face, which seemed to be burned. He also noticed that eye was blue as opposed to his other. This one he could tell was strong. Not stronger than him, but still impressive. The last person who entered the room managed to make his eyes wander a little bit. She wore the standard girl's uniform and had her hair done in a somewhat spiked ponytail with a bang across the left part of her face. In his opinion, she filled her uniform out nicely. His eyes widened slightly when he realized what he was doing and averted his eyes before he was caught. "Nice to know my hormones are working well," he thought sarcastically. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He didn't have much time resting his eyes, however. "Is this seat taken?" he heard from next to him. It was the ponytail girl. "No, go ahead," he told her. She nodded and put her stuff down before sitting down and turning to him. "My name is Yaoyorozu Momo. Nice to meet you," she introduced herself. "Likewise. Midoriya Izuku. I'll remember that. If you don't mind me asking, what's your quirk?" she asked curiously as she didn't see any mutations on his person. "Mochi." She blinked. "Mochi?" She was going to ask exactly what it did but stopped when the class heard someone cough from the front of the room. "It took you all of 8 seconds to quiet down," a bored, scruffy-looking man said from the front of the class. "Not bad, but we're going to have to work on it," he added. Taking in his appearance, Izuku recognized him as the underground hero Eraserhead. As his name suggests, he has the ability to temporarily erase someone's quirks. "Can his power affect me?" he thought to himself. "It'll be problematic if my devil fruit is unaffected. It could lead to questions." He toned the man out for the next few minutes, his mind going over different ways to get around the erasing issue. When he came back around, he caught the last bit his new sensei was saying. "To do that, we're going to have a quirk apprehension test. Everyone change into your PE uniforms and meet on the field in 10 minutes. he ordered. A few minutes later, out in the field, everyone was in their uniform waiting for the test to begin. Their instructor walked up to them and began going on about the exam when he was cut off by a pink girl with horns. She asked about the seemingly mandatory orientation for new students being held at the same time. Izuku was surprised to find out that UA allowed their teachers full control over their classes. Thus Aizawa decided they'd skip the orientation and begin their work right away. "Our class is going to miss it. The hero course doesn't have time for frivolous activities. Knowing your limits is important. You have to know where you stand to improve," he explained and looked at all of them, making sure he had their attention. "You'll be tested the same way you were back in middle school. The only difference is this time you'll be using your quirks," he finished. "Oh, this sounds like fun," the pink girl Mina, as he'd heard her be called, yelled out. That turned out to be the wrong thing to say as their teacher narrowed his eyes. "Fun? Then how about this? Whoever comes in last place will be getting expelled from the hero course and moved into general studies. Being a hero isn't about fun, it's serious work," he said before turning his eyes to Izuku, who was doubtful of the man's words. "Midoriya," he called out to him. "You scored the highest in the entrance exam. You'll be going first." He pointed at a circle drawn on the ground before handing him a small ball. "Throw this ball as hard as you can with your quirk. You can do anything so long as you remain in the circle." "How should I do it?" Izuku thought to himself as he gripped the ball. He looked out into the distance and nodded to himself. He extended his hand with the ball and gripped it well. Everyone watched as his forearm turned a pasty white color before it began expanding. It continued to do so and turned a bright red color. A loud boom was heard as the arm suddenly exploded and his hand along with the ball was launched into the air. Similar to last time, it caught on fire as it went. He watched as it got smaller and smaller before turning back to Aizawa. He noticed everyone's eyes glued to his right arm, now missing half of it before Mochi formed another arm, matched his skin tone and solidified. He flexed his hand slightly, getting used to the feeling of the arm, ignoring the creeped-out stares of some of his classmates. Aizawa didn't look bothered, seeing as he'd seen it before, and held up the device for all to see. 1610M, it read. "Deku. How the hell did you get a quirk?" Bakugo asked angrily as he stepped forward. He was stopped as the scarf their sensei wore wrapped around him instantly. Bakugo snarled but stopped resisting and was let go with a warning to control himself. The rest of the students followed after him, and some did better than others. Bakugo used his explosion to score 705.2M. Uraraka managed to score infinity as she removed the gravity from the ball and let it go up into the sky, never to come back down. Yaoyorozu had an interesting quirk. She could create anything from her body and used that to make a cannon to shoot the ball. Seeing that gave him an idea for the future. The exams proceeded, with the 50-meter dash being the next exam. The boy with the glasses, Ida, won that one since his quirk was pretty much built for speed. He himself finished with a time of 4 seconds flat. Only 1.03 seconds behind Ida. Next was a test of grip where his fellow classmate Mezu Shoji, who had multiple arms, crushed it with a result of 540 kilograms. Izuku coated his hand in Busa Shokuhaki and managed a respectable 250 kilograms. In the standing long jump, he simply stretched his leg completely across the sand pit instead of jumping. Bakugo used his explosions to propel himself forward, while some like Aoyama used his naval laser to get himself to the other side. In the repeated side-to-side steps he did well, but not as well as the shortest kid in their class. Mineta, who had the ability to pop the balls on his head and stick them to things, used them to bounce himself rapidly from side to side. Finally, after the last student finished, the results were up. Izuku managed to place first, followed by Momo, Todoroki, and Bakugo. For the next 3 years you'll be pushed to the absolute limit, and I'll expect you to live up to the expectations. Go beyond. Plus ultra. Also, I was lying about the last place being expelled. Aizawa told them. Mineta let out a sigh of relief, knowing he wouldn't be dropped from the program. Of course he was lying. Izuku heard Momo say from his side, though she said it low enough to where she believed no one would hear. So you knew it too? Izuku said as they walked back to their respective locker rooms to change. The two spoke all the way back to their locker rooms. Izuku never noticed the eyes of his teacher looking at him as he retreated. At the end of the day, when all of the students had left the school, only 2 people remained in Class 1A. So what did you think, Aizawa? Sneezu. They have potential, but there is one problem. Midoriya Izuku. The scruffy man replied. Something is off about him. I tried erasing my quirk on him today during a quirk exam, but it had no effect. That is peculiar. Perhaps we'll have to speak with him soon. I'll make a call to a friend of mine at the quirk registry office and we'll go from there. Nizu said before the two left the room. The next day. The second day of school so far hadn't been as exciting as the first. So far it had consisted of doing regular schoolwork. English classes, history, literature, and math and whatnot. While it wasn't the most fun, at least it wasn't difficult. He'd always been a studious kid and was now thankful for it, as he didn't have to pay much attention to understand what was going on during the lesson. Izuku ended up blocking out the current teacher's voice as he went over what some author meant in one of his lines in the book. His thoughts were elsewhere. After their quirk apprehension exams had ended, Izuku had gotten to talk to Momo on the way back to the locker rooms. He'd found out that her quirk let her create anything so long as she knew the atomic configuration of the item she was making, and it was non-living. It was perfect, he thought as he continued doodling into his notebook. Since the lesson began, he had began making a sketch detailing the trident Katakuri used and hoped to ask her sometime in the future if she could make it for him. He added as much detail as possible in an effort to make it as simple as possible to recreate. Likewise, in the way she told him about her power, he had told her how his quirk worked and explained its versatility. He knew she wasn't that impressed when he first told her it was mochi, but after he had explained its uses he felt proud when she asked to know more about it. Discreetly glancing to his right, he noticed that while she was taking notes she looked just as bored as he did. She turned to him and flashed him a small smile before taking a breath and continuing to write. If this had been pre-devil fruit, he would be up in the front taking notes like his life depended on it. No, not so much. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bell rang and the current teacher packed everything up and headed out. Sitting back in his chair, he stretched his arms out and let out a deep breath. About time, he said softly to himself. They had a few minutes of transition period before their next professor came in to teach the next subject, and many of the students took advantage. Most began talking to one another about anything that had happened or something they'd seen recently. The only ones not talking were Bakugo, who just looked upset, and Todoroki, who was reading a book. Midoriya-kun, he heard from next to him, I missed part of the notes from the beginning of the lesson. Do you mind if I borrow your notebook for a second? Momo asked him. Sure, he handed her the book. He watches as she copies down his notes before she turns the page. She frowns quickly in confusion before her eyes widen slightly, and she leans forward to take a closer look. What's this a doodle of? She asked as she held up the drawing of the trident. Maybe doodle was the wrong word. As to the right of it, it had lines leading to different parts of it with notes detailing the composition and sizes of the parts. It's something I want made as a support item. She turned her attention back to it. The handle was 5 feet long, made completely out of carbon fiber. At the top it had 3 prongs tightly held together, with the middle one being a full cylindrical spear with the 2 outer blades looking similar, only pointing slightly outward. They too were made out of carbon fiber. There was a scribble next to it where the word stainless steel had been crossed out. I wanted to wait until I knew you a bit better before asking, but since you've already seen it I might as well ask if you can make it. I'll pay you for your services if I have to, he told her. It shouldn't be too hard. The detailing on the drawing will make it a lot easier. I'll try it at home tonight to see if I can get it right, and I'll let you know. Can I take this page? She asked. Of course. Thank you, by the way. I know you'll do great. I'd rather not have to ask the support course to do it, he confessed. I am coming through the door like a normal person, a powerful voice yelled out from the front of the room. Everyone, even him, was surprised to see All Might in his Silver Age costume stand tall in front of them. His tendency to spaz out over pro heroes had calmed down over the years, but he occasionally let them slip out. It's time for your first heroics lesson. To your sides you'll see special cases with your names and a designated number on them. Inside are the hero costumes that were created based on the designs you submitted. Please get dressed and meet in the mock training field outside, he ordered before heading out. Doing as instructed, he looked for his name and grabbed his case. He was kind of excited. He'd finally see how the hero costume he'd submitted came out. When he opened the case in the boys' locker room, he couldn't stop the smile from forming on his face. Unlike Katakuri, who wore a black biker vest, he had opted for a sleeveless black shirt instead. It was fireproof and reinforced with special lightweight Kevlar to help minimize explosion damage. The best part, in his opinion, was the maroon-colored design on the back. It was the same as the bottom portion of Katakuri's tattoo that resembles a face with a stitched mouth and the word Charlotte, in English, above it in maroon letters. He had slim-fitting black pants equally resistant as his shirt. The only difference was that he kept his footwear the same, with the only difference being that they were designed to be more sturdy. Meaning they weren't suede like his regular pair, but made out of super lightweight metal that was soft on the inside so his foot wouldn't hurt. Overall, he was happy with how it had turned out. Giving himself another once-over, he left the locker room and headed to the field where some were already waiting. The moment he looked at a certain girl, he'd wished that he'd opted for the scarf Katakuri wore because he could feel the heat rising to his face. Momo was in her hero costume, which consisted of a red and white one-piece that was missing most of the middle, giving a view of some side boob. Suffice to say, he got an eyeful and had to control his imagination. Apart from that, she finished the look with a small brown skirt and matching red boots. She looked in his direction as he got closer. "Your hero costume is kind of plain, no?" she asked. Most others had some sort of unique bits on them. Bakugo with his grenades on his arms, Kirishima with the gears on his shoulders, Tsuyu with the goggles on her head, etc. "Yeah, but it's all I really need. I had originally designed this with a spike on my left knee, but it looks like that was declined," he commented. Soon all the remaining students made it onto the field in their respective hero costumes, and their class began. To everyone's surprise, they were doing mock battles where they'd be split up into two teams. Heroes and villains. Their objective was simple. If they were heroes, they had to capture a warhead that the villain team was to guard. If you were on the villain team, you had to stop the heroes from touching the warhead or capture them to win. All Might paired everyone up at random and had two groups go into the building. In the end, Izuku was paired up with Uraraka as the hero team versus Bakugo and Ida as the villains. To make things even better, he and Uraraka were first up. The villain team headed into the building first, while they had to wait 5 minutes before entering. Meanwhile, All Might and the other students headed to another room where they'd be watching the event go down until their turn came up. "So what's the plan, Midoriya-kun?" Uraraka asked nervously. "Bakugo doesn't get along with Ida. You won't coordinate with him or listen. He's most likely going to go off by himself and come after me the moment we can begin. I'll take care of him while you locate the warhead. However, don't engage. He's faster than you and physically stronger. Wait until I appear and we'll take him together. It shouldn't take too long," he explained. She was going to ask if he was sure it would happen like he had explained, but one good look at him stopped her. He looked completely calm, sure of himself, and had the utmost confidence that things would pan out. She would have to trust him. She nodded at him and walked forward when All Might's voice alerted them to begin. Sure enough, after only 2 minutes of walking through the building, they heard something. Izuku instantly recognized the sound of small explosions. The sounds got louder the closer the young hero in training got. Finally, the sandy blonde-haired student made it to them and stood tall, glaring at his green-haired classmate. "Go left and find the warhead," Izuku ordered. She nodded and ran off. He could see it in her eyes that she was surprised that Bakugo didn't even try to stop her from getting away. "All right, Deku, now it's just you and me," Bakugo said, releasing a few small explosions from his palms. Izuku internally smirked when he saw Bakugo get angrier at his lack of response. "Don't ignore me, loser," the blonde yelled as he propelled himself forward using his explosions. Starts off with a right hook, he thought. Having seen grown up around the blonde, he knew he always started with a right hook. He didn't even need his Kenbunshiku haki to tell him the first attack. As expected, when he got within striking distance, Bakugo threw his right hook, only for it to hit air as Izuku had ducked down and to the left. Not wasting any time, the devil fruit user extended his leg to nail the mock villain in the chin. He watched as Bakugo flipped in mid-air to force himself to land upright. The moment he landed, he swiped the back of his hand on his mouth and frowned when he saw red. The blonde immediately went on the offensive again and rushed forward once again using his quirk to propel himself. It'll be different this time, he thought as he saw a red outline of Bakugo in his mind move around. He smirked. Clever use of his quirk, I'll give him that, he added before he set up his counter. He knew it infuriated Bakugo that he wasn't moving from his spot, and didn't even look remotely worried. Once the blonde got close, he pointed his hands downward and created an explosion to change his trajectory in midair. Once he was over Izuku, he exploded once more to stop his momentum and point a hand at Izuku's back. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't expecting a glowing red arm to be sprouting from his target's back. Boom! Izuku said before his mochi arm exploded. He turned around and saw his childhood tormentor on the ground. Part of his face was black from the attack. He must have covered his face at the last moment and only got lightly charred. Tell me, Bakugo, did I do the explosion correctly? He mocked as the boy stood up before finally going on the offensive. Faster than Bakugo was expecting, Izuku appeared in front of him and kicked him in the chest. Following up, he extended his arms to grab him by the utility belt and bringing him back. Mochi Gatling, he called out as 6 arms sprouted from his back and began repeatedly punching. The arms punched rapidly for a couple of seconds before all of them punched his solar plexus at the same time, effectively sending him flying into the wall at the end of the corridor. Bakugo's back hit the wall hard enough that it left a small indentation along with cracks to form on the wall. I'm disappointed if this is all you're capable of, Izuku told him as he walked forward. The moment he donned his hero costume, he'd decided what his name and persona would be. If only Broly could see me now, what would she think? He briefly wondered before shaking his head of those thoughts. Don't look down on me. Bakugo managed to get out in between coughs as he tried to get up on shaky legs. Spectators' room. Their classmates as well as their heroics teacher watched the one-sided beatdowns with varying degrees of shock. Bakugo was powerful, there was no question about that. His quirk was versatile and in his hands was dangerous. So to see him getting handled was something else. Those who'd been in the same field with him in the entrance exam were more shocked than others. 2 certain people, however, were watching the battle play out extra carefully. The first was the half-hot half-cold quirk wielder Todoroki, who knew there was more to the green-haired student than others could see. The second was none other than Momo, who since she'd heard about his quirk was curious to see how anyone could use it effectively to be a hero. Needless to say, she was impressed. Damn, you'd never think Mochi of all things could be so versatile, Kirishima commented. He's creative. Tsuyu commented, that's why it's powerful. I don't think anyone else would be able to think to use it like that, she added. He did the same thing he did with a ball throw. Momo pitched in. Rather than shoot a ball, however, he pressurized his arm to the point that it just created an explosion mimicking Bakugo's quirk. He also seems to know his fighting style well as he had the arm ready beforehand. Whoa, look at that, Kirishima said, pointing to the screen. They watched as Bakugo created an explosion near Izuku's leg. That's not what had the red-haired man so amazed though, it was when they watched their classmate regrow his leg like nothing had happened. He just took the attack and shrugged it off. How manly, he complimented. The others ignored him and continued to watch as the green-haired boy grabbed the blonde by the face and slammed him into the ground. He followed that up by tossing him into the air and creating a giant mochi fist and punching him back into the wall. 1111. Kaminari's face scrunches up in sympathy as he watched Bakugo try to land a hit on Izuku only for his attacks to be dodged or deflected before he got tagged with a right hook and a straight left. It only got worse when Izuku pinned the boy to the wall and split his leg into 10 and each took turns kicking. You guys think maybe we should stop this? Jairu asked out loud after seeing her classmate switch from kicks to punches. Back inside the building, Izuku stopped his assault and watched as Bakugo dropped down face first. Alright, let's go find Uraraka, he said to himself quietly as he began walking away. After only 5 steps he stopped and narrowed his eyes. In his mind the shape of a gauntlet appeared before increasing in size. He frowned before he understood what it was. He made a tsk noise and turned around to see Bakugo reaching for one of the pins in his gauntlet. Not letting that happen, he dashed forward and stepped on the boy's arm, stopping him from pulling the pin. You don't think I'd really stand there and let you detonate that, did you? He asked rhetorically before he coated his right leg from the knee down in hockey and stomped, breaking the weapon. He then stuck his hand out and let it melt onto the boy until it completely enveloped his whole body but his head. With that done, he turned around and headed out. He chuckled a little when he heard Bakugo struggling to get out of the mochi. The rest of the test wasn't too difficult after that. Uraraka had done her job and found the bomb, and between the two of them had easily overpowered Ida. While he was fast, his technique was too linear. Plus his Kenbunshiku haki had easily helped him maneuver around the boy. A well-timed mochi attack had managed to get Ida stuck while Uraraka went to touch the bomb. All Might called the match and named them the winners and to report back to the room for an evaluation. They were then able to sit back and watch the rest of the students run the same situation. As he'd expected, Todoroki was indeed powerful. He had great control over ice and didn't look remotely winded after freezing the entire building. Momo's was impressive as well. She could literally make anything she wanted so long as it was inorganic. He briefly wondered if she'd ever thought about making money. An hour later everyone had gone and they were free to go. As he was heading to the station to head home, he couldn't help but be a little anxious. I really hope Momo can make the trident. I purposely made it as detailed as possible, it would really help me out. Right before he entered the station he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Quickly giving it a glance he saw he had a message from his mom. She wanted to know if he could pick up some batteries for their TV remote and pick up a new rice cooker since theirs was starting to break. He stepped out and looked around and luckily there was an electronics store nearby. The good thing about Japan was that electronics stores had almost everything in one of their 10 floors. From electronics to furniture. It took about 10 minutes to maneuver through all of the people browsing the shelves inside before he finally found what he was looking for. Though what he found managed to surprise him slightly. In front of him was UA brand batteries. They were blue and white, and if you looked closely they even had the PE uniform design on them. Designed to go beyond. He read the back of it out loud before turning them back around. Plus Ultra / Plus Ultra. He and someone else said at the same time. Turning around he came face to face with a young man about his age, though he was much taller. He had short black hair and wore a white button-up shirt with black jeans and matching black shoes. He had his right hand raised into the air and a giant smile on his face as he looked back at him. Sorry if I caught you off guard. I recognized your uniform and heard you reading the label and have always wanted to say, Plus Ultra. I love UA and saw my chance to say it. He explained before stiffening up and bowing down far enough to hit his head on the ground while apologizing again. Izuku blinked. Again. Don't worry about it, he replied. My name is Yurashi Inasa of Shiketsu High School. Nice to meet you. Inasa introduced himself. Midoriya Izuku. He greeted back before adding, if you go to Shiketsu, what are you doing here if your school is out west? Well, I actually live here, but the school year doesn't start for us until next week. I'm doing some last-minute shopping and picking up something for my dad while I'm at it. Inasa explained. Oh, that makes sense. But if you don't mind me asking, why didn't you apply to UA if you're here and you love it so much? He noticed the boy's smile drop ever so slightly before it was back in place. I actually did. I got recommendations to enter and pass their entrance exam, but in the end I decided against attending due to some personal reasons. He answered. Izuku was curious as to why anyone would decline UA but could tell he didn't want to go into more detail about it, so he let it drop. It's impressive that you managed to get into both UA and Shiketsu. It isn't easy from what I've heard of that school. Inasa nodded. Correct. Tell you what, let's walk and talk. I need to buy a small grill while I'm here. He said before walking towards the escalators. It's most likely in the same floor as the cooker anyway. Why not? The two continued talking as they looked for their respective items. Well, Inasa did most of the talking with Izuku giving his 2 cents every now and then or answering a question. Considering that his only friend, when he was younger, was Bakugo, this was a breath of fresh air. He actually found out that the boy's quirk was Whirlwind, and was very proficient in using it if he could get into the best hero schools. From what he gathered, he was smarter than he let on, and his favorite thing in a hero is passion. Finally, after a couple minutes of searching, the two had what they needed. Well, this is it, Midoriya. It was great meeting you. I'm glad that I was still able to make a friend from UA even though I don't attend it. The next time we meet will most likely be at the provisional license exam in a few months' time. Inasa said. If there's a battle portion this year, I hope I get to face you. I know you have passion and I'm curious to see how you use mochi in battle. He added with a challenging smile. Izuku felt himself smirk. Likewise. I want to see how strong you are and how you use wind to your advantage. I'll see you at the exam. He said, extending an arm. Inasa shook his hand and waved as he turned around and headed out. Wonder how I'd stack up against someone who uses wind. Guess we'll find out soon. He thought as he headed to the station. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Support the writer. Don't forget to like, sub, share and donate for more videos.